Welcome to episode number 50 of the American Regularis Podcast. I'm JD Walter, hoping you're having a great day. Had about a little 2-week hiatus. Apologize for that. I've been working on stuff, got some new gear for the podcast, and figuring some stuff out. Hence, that's the reason why we don't have the intro music bringing me in to this episode. As always, lots going on. Definitely can't touch on everything that's happened since the last time I've talked to you guys. But I kind of want to focus on just a disturbing trend that seems to really be coming into the light more and more these days. And that is just the issues with democracy in Europe in particular in this case. I know it wasn't all that long ago. Us Americans just got done with our election, and that provided us with all sorts of entertainment, all sorts of topics and coverage to talk about. And I'm as critical as the next guy. I think I like to complain about the American government a lot. You guys don't need to be reminded of that. But when we look over at what you're seeing in Europe right now, it is very disheartening. And I've talked at length about the migration problems that they have and things like that. Today, I just want to point out something that I think most of us Americans can kind of relate to, and it's just the dirty works and the hypocrisy and the dishonesty of politics and government over in Europe. In particular, relating to elections, campaigns, and, democracy nowadays is put on a pedestal. As much as anything in the world, usually you have a hard time, usually you have a hard time even getting through political speech without hearing the guy refer to democracy as sacred or cherished or beloved. I mean, words that you would use for God or your children. I mean, democracy is revered and idolized as much as anything I can think of in the political world. And to democracy's credit, it is generally pretty good at enabling a peaceful transfer of political power. Where it's not good is the fact that it's mob rule, essentially. It's divisive. It's oftentimes ineffective. The people you vote for don't do what they said they would. They don't do what you asked. And so in many ways, it's kind of a paper tiger. It's for all of these good things that you hear about democracy, it so often falls short. And many times it's not easy to see it without a little bit of introspection or without a little bit of investigation, rather. Right now in Europe, it's pretty much on the surface, the ugliness of, I don't want to say democracy, but I want to say the ugliness of democracy as used by the state and its agents, right? And I think the primary thing I should say when I'm making that distinction is you see this a lot in politics, whether it's a bill or a process, and it sounds good, but you will know the tree by the fruit it bears. And if it's bearing bad fruit, then, tough. I have this problem with the Constitution. It's a beautifully written document. It was one of the greatest pieces of things ever written. In terms of a bill or document that was trying to promote freedom and liberty and property rights in the individual and to put restrictions on the government, all these things that I I do hold very dear to me and would want to use those big words like politicians use democracy, the Constitution fails to deliver on them time and time again. Our constitutional amendments are violated all the time. Laws are written all the time, which are used to bypass or skirt around the Constitution, and the judges and the politicians don't want to have to adhere to the Constitution and its amendments, and so they just say, yes, this works, and we interpreted it to be not in conflict with the Constitution. We're seeing this with democracy in Europe right now, and not just in one or two places. A podcast or two ago, we talked about Romania, and with Georgescu, however, forgive my mispronunciation, and how he won the first round of their elections in dramatic fashion, and they annulled it. And we covered, he's a conspiracy theorist, and like, far be it for me to call everyone, someone a conspiracy theorist, but some of his were further on that. He's very nationalistic. We talked about how Romania's past with both the Nazis and the communists make extremism particularly scary because these guys have seen both ends of it in horrific ways. But they are just flat out deciding that, no, your votes didn't count. We don't like how it happened. Now, they also said it was something campaign finance issue. J.D. Vance talked about that. He said something like if $200,000, $300,000 or $1 million or whatever it was, if that's what's going to overthrow your democracy wasn't that strong. I'll agree completely with him. But there's also a thing, I've talked to cops before that I was like, well, you need to pull over someone. What do you do? And they're like, if you can't pull over someone, if you can't find someone, some reason to pull over someone, you shouldn't be a cop. And what they meant by that is there's just so many laws to follow. There's so many arbitrary things. I mean, you go past the license, the registration, a blinker. You could just lie that the brake light wasn't working. Any of these things. So, this would be using the law not to keep people in accordance with the laws and expectations of a society, but to use it as a cudgel, to beat someone over the head with it. That's what they do with these finance things. These Byzantine laws, and there are so many laws in every book, whether it's the tax code and it's hundreds of thousands of pages, and that's just taxes they can get you on. So, if you want to get a politician in trouble for something, you can. And now, by the way, without trying to sound like I'm speaking out of both sides of my mouth, I'm all for getting corrupt politicians in trouble. Prosecute them, I should say. Not persecute, prosecute them. Use the law justly, but don't use it arbitrarily. Don't use it in a way where you say, when I want you gone, I can have you gone. But I will turn a blind eye to justice or what is right or who has done what until I feel like it suits my desires and machinations. So let's go through some of these things that are happening in Europe right now because I've kind of set the groundwork. What all am I talking about? First off, we can look at Ukraine. Zelensky's term ended in May of 2024. We're well past that, over a year past that. He's banned 11 political parties, but when you listen to the mainstream media or corporate media, whatever we want to call it, Ukraine is this shining city on the hill for democracy. It's a democratic beacon of light. And you hear this, and it is fighting against, Putin, who's an authoritarian. Fair enough. But this idea where we dress up a corrupt nation in democratic garb and then tell everybody, look, it's definitely democratic. That one is just obvious. But it doesn't end there. It doesn't end because some excuse for martial law or whatever. Britain's system is two-tiered. They just voted for their parliament. They just voted overwhelmingly to, like, what was it? Build a brand new, like a huge airport in Pakistan. This isn't so much of a democratic process, but it shows you this are what people of England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland are being represented well by building an airport in Pakistan. And when you look at the members who voted for it, it takes a very cursory glance to understand who those people are actually representing. Okay, we've talked several times about the AfD or the AfD party in Germany. This is the right-wing party of Germany. They're conservative. They have been labeled as extremists so that the courts can legally spy on them. They've tried to revoke status of them. They've tried to ban them in certain, like, local elections, I believe. They have tried to hobble and hamstring the AfD at every turn. And when I say they, I'm saying the general consensus of political powers, movements, agencies, parties that espouse their love of the sacred cow known as democracy. When the AfD took second in the elections, they jumped up. They over-doubled from the previous elections, their gains. They were the second biggest party. And Germany has this parliamentary system where you're supposed to, or if not supposed to, you're required to coalition. You got to usually get a couple of parties together and say, hey, we're going to try to work together. And the first party is like the milquetoast, what maybe would be comparable to rhinos or something in America, is this milquetoast conservative party that's not really conservative. And rather than going with the more conservative party, they vowed not to. And they said, we're going to work with the lefties, the socialists, and the Greens well before we work with these guys. Even though a large percentage of Germans want to be represented by the AfD. But because they want secure borders, they are extremists. I think it's Alice Weidel, the chair of the AfD, she's a lesbian married to a Sri Lankan lady. But they're meant to basically be seen as the next installment of the Third Reich, the fourth or whatever. Time and time again, we see democracy where they hamstring people. Estonia. Now, I don't have a particular issue with this as far as I understand, I'm not an expert on this, but Estonia banned local voting for non-EU citizens, which sounds on the surface like, yeah, that makes sense. If they're not citizens, you shouldn't be voting there. I don't really have a problem with that until you see generally what it is some of these people have been living there for 30 years or something like that. It's like since the fall of the Berlin Wall, they've been stateless. This is basically to keep people from voting who are more pro-Russian. Now, if they're not citizens, I really don't have a problem with that one. As far as I'm understanding it, at face value. Why aren't they citizens? I don't know. But when it all goes together, you just see this thing where every time, whether the president who was the right-wing guy in the Balkans that got shot, wasn't it? A president or a prime minister, Slovakia or something. Every time, it seems like this emergence of conservatism in Europe is being fought not at the ballot box. Or if it is, it's being aided and abetted by lawfare. the cop that can pull you over for whatever reason earlier. The greatest example of this is Marine Le Pen, who has been really kind of the probably biggest figure in conservative parties of Europe for quite a while, over in France. She was recently found guilty of embezzling funds from the EU. Now, again, I don't want politicians to embezzle, but it sounds like what she did, and I can't get into the weeds on it. I'm not intelligently informed enough to tell you all the ins and outs, but a lot of people say, hey, what this lady is getting charged with is something that would make every single member of the EU Parliament just scared shitless, because it's something that is so trivial and something that's done by everyone so much. And actually, I think it was like the chair of the Bank of the EU had the same thing happen, but they just ignored it and put him right in. And it seems like it's a very arbitrary ruling by Marine Le Pen as these French elections come up. Now, she was fined I think it was 100,000 euros. She has 2 years of house arrest and can't run for 5 years. Now, I don't think they care one nickel about those first two things. But this lawfare, they said Marine Le Pen has been gaining and becoming more favorable, and far be it from them to let a voting, an election ruin their democracy. And so what do? They preserve democracy by making sure people they don't want to run can't run. It is kind of reminiscent. I think Dave Smith's talked on this before. Was it William F. Buckley? Is that his name? The conservative guy from the 70s. But he was, he wanted to preach about small government or this or that. But then he had to become this cold warrior that needed a big government. We need a big government over here to protect us from the big government over there. And it was completely antithetical to the point. It was like, no, the problem is big government. We don't want those guys over here, but we don't want to make our own. And in such simple terms, yes, I guess one that is culturally akin to you is preferable, sure. But logically, you can't defend a democracy, you can't preserve the democratic principles if you're doing it in surreptitious ways that are undemocratic. Now, what I see as the main problem is, as this goes on, and there are more and more examples, and I wouldn't put this entirely on the left. I think it's the left right now because the left has been in power for so long, but I have no issues imagining right-wingers doing this should the roles be reversed. But what happens after so many examples and so many elections that are redacted or overdone or recounted? We've seen it in the U.S. People have lost tons of faith in the elections. Pelosi says one was rigged. Trump says one was rigged. And they go back and forth. And democracy requires a degree of trust and faith in the process. And just like a couple where one of the people, the husband, let's say, is lying about everything or cheating about everything or misappropriating funds constantly, that's going to erode the faith of his wife, right? This is the exact same scenario we can imagine as governments routinely act in bad faith towards the very thing that they say they are protecting and promoting. Eventually, you're not going to believe them anymore. And what happens when people quit believing in the democratic process? You lose the one thing that I really gave democracy credit at the beginning, which is peaceful transference of political power. Okay? The French, Marine Le Pen's people, they know this as good as anybody. So, I don't know when it takes. I don't know which straw breaks that camel's back, but you don't want to be around when it does. Okay, last I wanted to just touch real quick on something I heard or read on X, that Ben Shapiro had agreed to debate Dave Smith on Israel-Palestine. That made this guy's heart beat all a flutter. Is that how the poems say it? That got me excited. That got me very amped up. Can't wait to see that. That one will be truly great. I think, well, two things. There's no one that's a bigger fan of Dave Smith than I. And man, is Ben Shapiro bad on Israel and other things. So, best of luck to Dave Smith if that's true. I can't wait to see it. And there's been a lot of speculation about the Daily Wire in general, if they're in financial trouble and whatnot. So this could be an event that's happening at a very monumental time for Shapiro and his organization and all that. So very interested in seeing that. And while we're talking about Dave Smith, I've seen a lot of heat on Twitter. Excuse me, X. I'm an old man. That was starting, I guess, a beef or whatever you want to call it. Sam Harris talking about Dave Smith being on Joe Rogan. Now, I've waited till this very moment to watch. So you're going to get a live reaction from me. I will say, I'm going to read what Dave Smith responded with. No, I'll respond out. I'll talk about what Dave Smith says afterwards, because even though I haven't heard it yet, Dave Smith's response is pretty darn funny. Okay, so let's listen to Sam Harris. I don't know. I think he's just putting this out there on his own. I don't think it's an interview, but I could be wrong. Let's listen to what he has to say about Joe Rogan and his choice of people on his podcast.
Joe is a genuinely good guy who wants good things for people. But he is honestly in over his head on so many topics of great consequence, right? When he brings someone on to just shoot the shit about, how the Holocaust is not what you think it was, right? And maybe Churchill's the bad guy.
I should preface, Sam Harris is an intellectual. He also, one of the more famous things he's talked about, like he vindicated torture. He talked about he is an intellectual, but he really fancies himself as an intellectual, and an intellectual above your intellectuals. He also, someone was arguing with him during the COVID lockdown things. He's like, well, imagine if this disease was, more virulent and more pathogenic and it was much nastier, then would we need this stuff? And it was like, he reframes a lot of narratives hypothetically to where then he goes, well, see, so therefore, because it could have been, therefore it is. But I digress. Sam Harris, intellectual, big new atheist guy. He's godless. And he is smart, but those are the two things you should know.
In World War II.
Is that Tucker?
Or he's got Dave Smith, being treated as an expert on Israel and Palestine and the history of that conflict and the moral emergency that came to the world's attention on October 7th, and what is appropriate to think in the aftermath of all of that, right? Dave Smith is the only reason why anyone knows what Dave Smith thinks about any of this is very likely because Joe had him on multiple times to talk about it, right? He's a pure misinformation artist and on top of many others.
Okay, so before he gets into other people, pure misinformation artist, kind of a left-wing talking point. Now, you can give bad information. That's nothing wrong with saying that. But like I said, Sam Harris has given out terrible information is, particularly during COVID. And he's refuted a lot of these, people he opposes now. A lot of times it comes down to ad hominems, or they're just not as qualified as me, or like in this case, he's like, well, the only reason people know who Dave Smith is because Joe's had him on a bunch. Okay, so I can know more. I don't think I do. I could know more than Sam Harris on the Israel-Palestine debate. No one's having me on, right? Some truck driver out of Wisconsin could too. It's not unheard of. There probably is a guy that could give him a run for his money. Just because Joe Rogan, like your fame is through Joe Rogan, so what? Your fame is through one of the biggest media platforms in the world repeatedly having you on. That's not a very good argument against Dave Smith. Would it be better if he was on The View? Would it be better if he was on the Today Show? Or if the government hired him as a TikTok influencer? Would these things make Dave Smith more valuable? Would it improve his pedigree in the eyes of Sam Harris?
And when Joe talks to someone like Trump or Tucker Carlson or any of these other guys who lie as freely as they breathe and doesn't push back against any of their lies. In fact, in Trump's case, really fairly energetically helped put his lies into the most plausible possible shape. It is irresponsible. I mean, it is directly harmful. Our society is as politically shattered as it is, in part because of how Joe has interacted with information.
Okay, so we're politically shattered because Joe Rogan doesn't confront people every time he disagrees with them. That would be a huge misunderstanding that I think the left gets wrong a lot. You don't have to argue and butt heads and get your little feather in your cap for every virtue signal to let people know that you don't agree. I'm sure, Rogan talked in retrospect. He kind of let Trump go on, and he's like, well, what data do you have on, Georgia and the election? And he's like, yeah, he never gave me a good answer. But because he didn't stand up and stick his chest out and clutch his pearls, it wasn't good enough for Sam Harris. So there's a real misunderstanding simply on why, what is it he said, we're politically shattered or divided. So in his mind, because it's not manicured, because Joe Rogan's having 3-hour podcasts with a large group of people where they can say what they want, and he has enough faith in the viewer to make their own decisions or possibly do their own research, which is dreaded to a guy like Sam Harris. There's a lot of people when we talk about upper class or classes, everyone thinks about it economically. Like, the elites. We think about money and power. Sam Harris is one of those guys who just thinks you're too dumb. He's an intellectual classist. He thinks his brain runs much better than yours. And in some regards, it probably does. And in other regards, yours will lap him on other things. But it is dangerous for Joe Rogan to give you a 3-hour podcast with people that don't think like Sam Harris, for people that might get edited on CNN. And now they're not getting edited. Oh my. All right, let's listen to the last, and I won't interrupt until it's over.
I think a lot of this is inadvertent, or maybe all of it's inadvertent, but it is also avoidable, right? He could actually take the responsibility that really is his to take at this point to get his facts straight and have someone other than Jamie there riding shotgun with him. He could have 2 brilliant journalists whose full-time job, he could pay each of them $1 million a year just to sit there and do and make sure he doesn't put his foot in his mouth in a colossally irresponsible way, right? I mean, it's like it would be very simple to do a better job.
All right, so there it is. His solution: pay a couple of fact checkers $2 million a year, and that would increase the show. I'm sure it'd be better. Thankfully, thank God we have Sam Harris around so he can tell Joe Rogan how to have a successful podcast. Now, he might not be talking, in pecuniary terms, but he's talking about how to make it better or more credible. Except you're forgetting, Sam, that you guys both had podcasts during lockdown. And all these guys that were misinformation that Joe Rogan put on, all these guys that were misinformation that he sat down with and listened to, they all came out smelling like a bunch of damn roses. Where you had to make up hypothetical situations where your tyrannical views and authoritarian views could have been justified. Right? But it wasn't about what was efficacious. It wasn't about what was correct. It wasn't about what was known with Sam Harris. Sam Harris has no God. He's, like I said, he's a very avid atheist. He views himself as one of the smartest things in the universe. And so he's going to have a natural tendency to side on authoritarianism because nobody knows more than Sam Harris. Why would you not have an authoritarian leaning? Why would you not want these lockdowns so you could say, look, leave it to the experts like me? That's what he is. Now, Dave Smith is what? He's a podcaster and stand-up comedian who's drinking a beer with Joe Rogan, and they talk about MMA during the middle of it, and then they go on. And it doesn't matter that he's right or wrong. It's who the hell is this guy? And I already shut my window, but Dave Smith's response was like, yeah, you're right. I shouldn't have got all my fame or notoriety or whatever you call it by going on the Joe Rogan show. He's like, I should have just did it the old-fashioned way by having my mom create the Golden Girls, which is a dig at Sam Harris. He's a Nepo baby. He grew up with a silver spoon in his mouth. Hollywood type, all sorts of money. His mom created the Golden Girls. He was able to go into whatever school he wanted, had the best tutors, and it doesn't mean he's not smart or accomplished. But for him to poke fun at Dave Smith impressing and making friends with Joe Rogan to where he's been on multiple times, maybe if you weren't a self-righteous prick, maybe you'd be back on Joe Rogan podcast more too, Sam Harris. So maybe some of it's personality. Maybe it is. I would say it is, because Dave Smith seems a lot more likable than Sam Harris. But if all those things are even and Sam Harris turns himself into a wonderful, charming guy, he's still wrong. He's still wrong about everything he said in COVID. And other things. He's still wrong about advocating for torture. He's still wrong about Israel-Palestine. All right. Dave Smith didn't need me to defend him, but I'm going to do it anyways. You guys have a good week. We'll catch you next week. Thank you for listening. Like and subscribe.